like a really interesting thing, one of my favorite like chest pressing movements, anything to do where we can like have convergence, right? Because the pecs are a converging muscle type.
Yeah.
So where we're challenging the pecs through that full range of motion, and then people ask, well, I don't have access sometimes, to like a converging chest press.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have one like this where it's fixed, is concentrating on literally just using kind of that bottom half to the mid-range range of motion, because after that, it's more or less you're looking at locking out the elbow. So that elbow extension, that last top half of that press is pretty much going to be mostly triceps. And that's kind of that's like literally like an old school bodybuilder type thing that like still really true, even when you break down the internal movement arms of the muscles throughout those joint angle ranges of motion, right? So if we have a Smith machine or we have something like this where our hands are like more fixed here and they don't get to converge throughout that horizontal adduction, like you can tell people just stay within this partial range of motion, where people remember bodybuilders just talk about keeping constant tension on the muscle. Mm-hmm. That's actually kind of a true thing. So, because from here to here, like the pecs start to actually lose some of their leverage, and it's going to be a lot of anterior delt, and it's going to be triceps, all depending on your grip width. So that's also controlled. So like when you're working in this closer grip like this, you're taking the arm through a greater degree of flexion to extension. So it is end up being more triceps. Whereas when you're out wide like this, you don't have as much joint angle range of motion at that elbow. So there's less flexion to extension. So it's going to be a little bit more pecs and anterior delts when you actually set up that way. So the pecs are one of the more complicated ones, because the clavicular pec actually needs a more an oblique kind of way that the humerus runs, and then like the sternal pecs need a little bit more of this, and the actual lower pecs are actually a shoulder extensor, and they bring the arm down like this. So the pecs have a lot of different functions and get leverages at very different angle ranges of motion. They're actually one of the more complicated muscles to train if you're trying to be really precise and nuanced, pedantic about the way that you're training your pecs. So, whereas, believe it or not, something like the glutes are not, despite the fact that they have several different component function with them, it's really not overly difficult to pick a couple of good glute exercises. Something like a hip thrust or a glute bridge where you're training, you're loading hip extension. And then the upper glute fibers, really they're the only ones between the upper and lower glute fibers that have kind of a more dynamic function to them. So they can do some abduction and external rotation. So, anything where you're moving like this right here is going to challenge those upper glute fibers, where if you're just moving into pure hip extension, that's a great way to train both the upper and lower glutes. But the lower glutes are going to usually do a little bit more hip extension in those type of motions. So what I was getting at with that is that when people think of training something like the glutes and they're using like 8 different exercises, a lot of them are very redundant. But what you have to look at is just the resistance profiles, because if you're training glutes, you're doing hip extension, or you're probably doing some external rotation. If you're trying to train the glute medius, you're going to do some straight abduction because it's a better abductor. So it's not really that complicated. The big one in the last few years has been like lat work, because the lats have several different divisions. But training the lats through 2 motions, and that's basically pulling like down like this, or an old lat pull down, like through like just doing adduction in the frontal plane. That's going to be the lower and lumbar lat divisions, and then pulling through here, like I was talking about, is probably going to be more of the thoracic. So you don't need a whole bunch of different motions. What you end up looking at is that you're going to use those same motions, but sometimes use different resistance profiles associated with those motions. And that's how you end up targeting those different divisions of muscles like that. So you kind of have to combine those 2 things. What either division or what muscle has the best leverage at these particular joint angle ranges of motion, and where's that peak resistance occurring as I'm going through it. So that's how you kind of narrow down, like, what am I really training here when I do this exercise?
Yeah. What's the output that you're after?
100%. 100%.